So I'm going to start today with Katie Kirsch. She's an immigration attorney that works with me at ABLE. I'm just going to give her now the opening for her to tell us about her work, what she does, and then just talk about a couple of issues that she wants to let you know about.
Great. Thank you, Maria and Yolanda and everyone else for the invitation to come and speak today. As Maria mentioned, I am an attorney at ABLE, Advocates for Basic Legal Equality. I work in our Dayton office, and I work primarily in my immigration part of my work is focused on federal litigation, civil rights litigation, challenging what we believe are unconstitutional policies that discriminate against immigrants, and oftentimes revolving around local law enforcement and collaboration or unlawful collaboration with immigration. And then also I represent a lot of clients in victim-based forms of relief, like non-immigrant status for victims of crime or non-immigrant status for victims of human trafficking. So I was asked to come today to speak to you all about a few policy updates. As Maria mentioned, there are so many updates that have happened, particularly in the Trump administration. I would argue almost all of them affect Ohio. So I'm going to pick a few, and then of course, if people want to talk about other things, perhaps during the question and answer session, we can do that. So the first policy update I wanted to talk about is what is going on with Daca, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. As most of you probably know, Daca was rescinded on September 5th of 2017. Interestingly enough, the Attorney General and not someone from Homeland Security announced that. And after that announcement was made, the then Secretary of Homeland Security issued a memo officially rescinding it, which becomes important to what's happened this year, officially rescinding the program. It was effective immediately. So there was, as you can imagine and probably have heard about, a lot of litigation that stemmed from that rescission, trying to block it or reverse it. And a lot of that litigation centered around the argument that the way in which the Trump administration, that they couldn't do it, they couldn't rescind it, and then also the way in which they rescinded it was arbitrary and capricious. It was a violation of the Administrative Procedures Act, which just in simple terms, it was not well reasoned. They didn't have good reasoning when they rescinded it in that memo that then Secretary Elaine Duke wrote. So again, litigation was filed in 2017. Fast forward to June 18th of 2020, and in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court in NAACP v. Trump, the Supreme Court held that the way that the Trump administration had terminated DACA was a violation of the Administrative Procedures Act. It's important, I remember when the day it came down and everybody was talking and I hadn't had a chance to read the opinion and everyone was like, yes, they upheld DACA, like DACA's going forward. And then I read the opinion and I was like, oh, it's not exactly what they said. So to kind of break it down a little bit, they've held that the way the Trump administration rescinded DACA was unlawful, was what I said, arbitrary and capricious, or it was not well reasoned. One of the good things about the opinion, though, I thought was they hammered a lot on what we call the reliance interest of the dreamers, of the DACA recipients and future DACA applicants. They really held that in rescinding DACA in the way they had in the memo that had been issued, that the government didn't really take into account what a powerful and profoundly negative effect doing so, rescinding the DACA program would have. And I have a quote that I thought was really powerful from the Supreme Court opinion. Respondents in their amici assert that there was much for DHS to consider. They stress that since 2012, DACA recipients have enrolled in degree programs, embarked on careers, started businesses, purchased homes, and even married and all had children, all in reliance on the DACA program. The consequences of the rescission, respondents emphasized, would radiate outward to DACA recipients' families, including their 200,000 US citizen children, to the schools where DACA recipients study and teach, and to the employers who have invested time and money in training them. So, there was a lot of advocates, and certainly the people who were directly affected were happy to see that the Supreme Court was acknowledging what a profound effect this rescission had, not only on DACA recipients, but on other people and their families, their employers, their communities. So effectively what that did is it vacated the memo that had the Duke memo that had rescinded DACA in 2017. Unfortunately, the Trump administration pretty quickly acted and said, okay, they sent out another memo and said, we're going to continue to accept DACA renewals, but we're still not going to accept initial DACA applications for people who had never applied before. And we're not going to accept applications for advanced parole, which is where you get permission to leave, to come back, you can leave, but to come back to the United States with permission if you do leave. So right now they're in a period of what they call review and reconsideration. There have been attempts to file litigation to, holding USCIS in contempt, arguing that the Supreme Court and another decision out of Baltimore had said that they need to, USCIS needs to accept initial DACA applications, but so far nothing has moved forward, and their USCIS, as we sit right now, is not accepting initial DACA applications. I was asked to talk a little bit about what could potentially change in light of the fact that we have an election going on in about 10 days. It is possible that a new administration, the current administration could decide to start accepting initial applications tomorrow. It's within their discretion. A new administration could also decide to do that. They could also decide not to fight the litigation in the courts that is trying to challenge the rescission because some of that is still pending. So, we're hopeful, I think everyone's sort of cautiously hopeful that perhaps DACA will become a fully functioning program again. But as we said today, unfortunately, it hasn't. It is only available to people who already have it and seek to renew it. And also, unfortunately, they have the government changed the time period in which they will renew. It used to be you got your deferred action and work permit renewed for 2 years, and now it's only 1 year. So we're kind of in a wait and see pattern with DACA, I would say. The second policy issue I wanted to discuss is the new public charge determination, the regulations that were passed in last year. So to take a really brief step back, public charge is a ground of inadmissibility, and we may get more into this in a larger sense later in the session if we have time. But inadmissibility is one of the biggest inadmissibility grounds are one of the biggest traps for people in immigration law. And they're basically, tons of parts of the Immigration Nationality Act that say, if you've done this, then you cannot come to the United States, so you cannot get a visa. And one of the grounds of inadmissibility is if you are likely to become a public charge, which means if you are likely to become dependent on public benefits in the foreseeable future. And that ground of inadmissibility, public charge has existed for a very long time. But more recently, the Trump administration has tried to revise the test that they use to determine whether someone is going to become a public charge and therefore cannot get their visa or lawful permanent resident status to stay in the United States. What they did is they added a lot of different public benefits programs. So before it was mostly if you received a lot of types of cash assistance. They added, for example, SNAP benefits, or what we colloquially call food stamps. They added Section 8 housing and public housing assistance, and they added Medicaid to the list of programs that if someone receives these programs, these benefits, they're likely to become a public charge, and that could affect their ability to get status in the United States. There was a lot of misinformation going on. Well, let me back up for a second. So the new reg was challenged, and there was a preliminary injunction, which means an initial temporary stop was granted by a court in October, but the Supreme Court actually held that the program could go forward in February of this year. So the current public charge rules do apply. I would be remiss if I didn't take a second to talk about the misnomers, because I know in my work in Dayton, we get a lot of questions about public charge, and there's just a lot of misinformation that people have. It's really important to know that a lot of the public benefits programs that would cause you to possibly get a public charge determination, or the government to think that you would be a public charge, are things that undocumented immigrants do not qualify for, especially in Ohio. Undocumented immigrants do not qualify for food stamps. They do not qualify for housing assistance. Mixed status families may qualify for some of these things. I have a lot of clients whose kids receive food assistance, but that does not make you a public charge. If your children receive those benefits, you as an adult applying to get a status or lawful permanent residence or visa would not be considered public charge just because your children get them. It's a little bit more complicated than that, and if people have questions, they should definitely talk to an immigration attorney. But that's the sort of short version. It's also really important to remember that people who are here on immigrant visas, or I'm sorry, on humanitarian visas or humanitarian forms of relief, are accepted from public charge. They do not have to worry about public charge. So refugees, asylees, people with special immigrant juvenile status, people who are in T or U non-immigrant status, they do not have to worry about public charge and should absolutely take advantage of programs that they are eligible to receive. And it's also one of the biggest questions that I've gotten in my practice is for people, we run a naturalization clinic in Dayton, and there are a lot of lawful permanent residents coming to apply for citizenship who are concerned because they want to unenroll their kids in Medicaid before they apply for citizenship because they're worried that they'll be determined to be a public charge. And people who are already here with their lawful permanent residence or green card are not going to have to go through a public charge consideration. So you should absolutely encourage people to apply for fee waivers. And of course, if they have questions, they should talk to an attorney. You know, in terms of how this could all be changed under a new administration, it's a little bit more complicated because there's more permanence in this program because a new rule or regulation was implemented. It's not permanent, but the Biden administration could potentially, if we had one, could potentially issue an executive order stopping the program, or could issue a new rule, essentially reverting us back to the old public charge determination or something new altogether. The next thing I want to talk about is this is not one particular policy, but it's the role that local law enforcement, the increased role that local law enforcement has played in immigration enforcement, particularly in the last 3-4 years. When the new administration took office, when Trump took office in January 2017, there was some pretty immediate calls to action to have local law enforcement assist ICE or Border Patrol with their immigration enforcement responsibilities. And that's obviously really concerning for a lot of reasons. One, we want local law enforcement to focus on enforcing the criminal laws that they are, authorized to enforce, and not focus their time on enforcing immigration law. Second of all, it makes situations ripe for racial profiling because local law enforcement does not receive the training that ICE and Border Patrol receive about immigration laws and how to, I'm not saying that ICE and Border Patrol are not biased, but they're not receiving even the training that the immigration receives to, identify potential immigration people who are violating immigration laws. So it's very concerning. And we have seen an uptick, for example, around the northern border of Ohio, of highway patrol turning people over to Border Patrol after routine traffic stops. I've seen an uptick in the Dayton area, not necessarily in the city of Dayton, but around where I practice, of local law enforcement stopping someone for running a red light, for example, or a stop sign, and then holding them there until ICE can come forward. And that's where we really need to take action as a state, because this is an issue where we can have some local control in fighting back against this policy. This is something ABLE is working on. So that's one of the issues we've seen. I mean, another way you can tell is even if local police departments go to apply for grants, they have to sign all this paperwork certifying that they're not going to interfere with any of their government officials' desire to help ICE enforce immigration policy, or help Department of Homeland Security enforce immigration policy. And we also have seen a resurgence of the Secure Communities program, which is where people are arrested or for any reason taken down and fingerprinted at a police station or a jail. Their fingerprints are forwarded to ICE, to immigration, to their database, and ICE is given the opportunity to put a detainer request on them for up to 48 hours. So they're usually held after the time that they would normally be allowed to be released. So it's very concerning. And we really need to find ways to work together as a state now, regardless of what happens with the election, to fight back against those issues. I know in Dayton, we have a group, Latinos Unidos, that's trying to work on getting an ordinance passed regarding the use of surveillance technology with local police departments and how that technology is used. So there are different ways that we can do that. We can work to try to take some more local control of these issues. And the last thing I want to mention for a policy change is the change in the number of refugees that are going to be admitted, what we call the refugee cap. The president is the sole person who is able to determine through his or her authority over the Department of State how many refugees are admitted to the United States every year. The US has historically admitted the largest number of refugees, but under the Trump administration, that number has gone down, even though the number of refugees worldwide continues to increase. So for example, in 2016, the refugee cap was 85,000 refugees, which doesn't sound like a lot, but we are one of the larger refugee admitters and providers of relocation services in the world. But in this fiscal year, in October, the president declared that we were going to only admit 18,000 refugees to the United States. And it's very concerning. It gets to this otherization of immigrants that the administration has tried to implement, and it impacts Ohio specifically because Ohio is accepts one of the largest refugee resettlement populations in the country. The closest data I was able to find was 2018, but in 2018, we were the state that accepted the third largest amount of refugees in the country, third only to Texas and Washington. So, refugees are a big part of the fabric of our state. They're a big part of the economy of the refugee resettlement agencies. They rely on the funding that comes with refugee admissions to continue providing services to the communities. And so that's a huge issue. And it's something that the president could theoretically reverse. It would probably take an executive order before the next year on a new president could reverse on day one. So I'll close with that. I have so much more to say, but I will let other people go and maybe add some things later. So thank you.
Thank you, Katie. That was super informative. We'll get to questions after because there's a lot of topics that I know you can talk about some more. Also, we asked people to ask questions in the Q&A. Unfortunately, we don't know if it's working. So if I might open the chat for a little bit for people to let us know whether they are able to ask questions. Otherwise, you can see them towards the end. We are working on that. I'm sorry about that. Next, we have Brian Huffman, who's also an immigration attorney here in Ohio. And he's going to talk to us about his work and also about the immigration court. And he does a lot of detention work. So that's kind of his specialty in a little bit. Okay. Go ahead, Brian.
Thanks, Maria. Thanks for the intro. And thanks to Yolanda and Lynn for organizing this and inviting us all to participate. I'm going to see if I can pull off a screen share here so I can show you a few slides as I talk about topics, mostly, as Maria mentioned, related to detention. So I've been very lucky in my career. I've gotten the chance to work with a lot of different great nonprofits, both here in Ohio and down at the border. And one of the things that struck me is, given the huge diversity of Ohio's immigrant community, there's a lot of organizations that do a lot of great work on behalf of that community. But Ohio doesn't yet have a project that's focused either exclusively or primarily on people in detention. So there are 3 ICE detention centers that have most of the people who are arrested for immigration violations in Ohio. Those are the Butler County Jail down in Hamilton, the Geauga County Jail in Chardon, and the Seneca County Jail in Tippin, with the tiny little Morrow County Jail in Mount Gilead also holding some folks who are about to be removed from the United States. So I picked 2020 to quit my job and lose my health insurance and launch this little endeavor of my own to try to start a nonprofit dedicated to Ohio's detained population. And had I known that most of the year would be spent doing Zoom meetings because of coronavirus, I may have timed those life choices a little bit differently, but hindsight, as they say, is 2020. So I want to take a step back and give just a huge 20,000-foot overview of immigration as a whole, because really the kind of immigration that most of the panelists here focus on is protective immigration, people who are fleeing harm or have been harmed and need some kind of protection. So when I went to law school at Ohio State, go Bucks, they literally gave us a book called The A to Z Guide to Legal Specialty. And it was everything from admiralty law to zoology law. There's so many different kinds of law you can specialize in. I had a lot of friends in law school who wanted to be sports and entertainment agents, and so went to law school with that in mind. And just as the practice of law is extremely diverse, there's also a huge amount of diversity within immigration law itself. So when you say immigration law, immigration lawyer, there's actually immigration lawyers whose day-to-day lives look nothing like the kind of work that Katie and Maria and I do, and vice versa. It's just a huge practice area with lots of different subspecialties. And I've broken it down into three kind of broad categories. So family-based immigration is somewhat self-explanatory. You get married to someone who's not a U.S. citizen. Maybe you have a distant relative, an aunt or uncle who's not a U.S. citizen, and you want to bring those people to the U.S. There's a whole system of family-based immigration for that. Business immigration is also its own world unto itself. There are, Katie and Maria and I go to conferences all the time with lawyers talking about all these obscure H and EB, different outstanding researcher and skilled software technician visas. I know nothing about any of those. But suffice it to say, business immigration is a whole world unto itself. There are international treaty investors who get special treatment based on how much money they invest, and all kinds of nuances there. The third category is what I would call broadly protective immigration. And that's where the nonprofit organizations that the three of us work at spend a lot of their resources. So these are things like people who are applying for asylum, refugees who are fleeing wars, victims of domestic violence, crime victims, abandoned children. These are all people who get immigration status or apply for immigration status based on the need for protection. So just keep in mind, a lot of the things that we're talking about are exclusive to the area of protective immigration. There's a lot of changes that Congress and the administration need to make in the family and business immigration systems as well. One example is that the number of skilled worker visas that is issued every year has such a low cap that you have hundreds of companies spending all this money applying for visas to bring workers over that they only have a small chance of actually ever getting. So all kinds of reform is needed in these other areas, but I want to talk more today about protective immigration. Let me give you a couple examples of how these types of immigration, these categories actually intermingle, and why maybe it's so difficult to be an immigration practitioner in this day and age. So I've got three cases up here. These are actually based on real cases that I worked on in the last couple of years through different organizations. And I want to just tell their stories briefly so you can get an idea of how these people navigate the system, and really so you can see how, in so many cases, the results you get in your immigration case in the US depend on the resources that you started out with, such as in many aspects of life, right? So the first case is Tomas. Again, this is based on a real client. When we talk about gangs, I think there's a big miscommunication when an immigration lawyer says a criminal gang versus when somebody who lives in inner city America says a criminal gang. Yes, gangs are problems all over the world, and we certainly have them in the United States. But criminal gangs in Central America and places like Guatemala are actually the de facto governments in many parts of the country. So there are places in El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala where anytime you have a problem, you don't go to the police, you go to your local gang boss. The people who are levying taxes are gang leaders, enforcing codes of behavior, controlling who goes into and out of certain neighborhoods. So I have a lot of clients, and I'm sure Katie and Maria do too, who are fleeing this kind of gang violence, who are being run out of town by people saying, look, you have to join our gang or we're going to kill you, we're going to kill your family. So that's what happened to poor Tomas. Tomas, I think he was 16 when he left Guatemala. No, he was about to turn 18 when he left Guatemala. Did not want to join a gang, left on foot, made it all the way across Mexico, essentially walking, taking buses and trains, came to the US border. And right away, we see one of the differences in the way people are treated now versus prior to the Obama administration. It used to be that if you made it to the United States and you wanted to apply for asylum or you had some claim for relief, they would screen you right at the border and say, is this somebody who we can simply release to family members right from here, right from the border? Or is this somebody who we need to put into detention to figure out whether they're a flight risk or a danger to the community? So years and years ago, maybe prior to 2014 or 2015, we saw a lot of people who came to the US and were released through some form of supervision, and they could stay with family members while they applied for asylum. Fast forward to the middle of the Obama administration to the present, And basically everybody gets arrested. The default is no matter what you show up with at the border, you're getting arrested, you're going to jail, and then it's up to you to try to fight your way back out. So Tomas, like everybody else, is detained at the border. He's sent to one of these huge border prison complexes with thousands of other people. A lot of them are also seeking asylum. And he doesn't have a lawyer. He doesn't have any money. So he goes to court by himself. These are hearings that are conducted over video links. So Tomas is in a little prison cell with a webcam. The judge is in El Paso or Nogales or somewhere much nicer than the little detention center Tomas is in. And he goes to a couple of different hearings. The judge keeps saying, you should really hire a lawyer. I'm going to give you a little more time. You should fill out these forms. I'm going to give you some more time. Finally, because he doesn't have a lawyer, he's at least able to get a couple of things together, send them to the judge. The judge says, okay, I see you have a relative in Minneapolis, but I think you're still some level of a flight risk. I'm going to set you a $15,000 bond. Now, unlike in criminal court, where if a criminal court judge sets you a bond, usually you pay about 10% of that and you get released the same day. In immigration court, you have to pay the entire amount of the bond. So if the immigration judge tells Tomas, your bond is $15,000, he needs someone who can get a cashier's check for the full $15,000 and take it to an ICE office to post as bond. Like so many people, that's just not even within the realm of possibility for Tomas. So after his next hearing, he just tells the judge, look, Your Honor, send me back to Guatemala. I don't have any money. Nobody's helping me. I can't get out of here. I can't fill out these forms because I don't speak English. Just send me back. That is unfortunately very typical of asylum seekers in this day and age under this administration. And in fact, the Cleveland Federal Building where the Immigration Court for Ohio is housed recently just reopened for public observers. So you can, as a member of the public, go to the immigration court on the 13th floor of the federal building in Cleveland, and you can literally watch this happen again and again, where people are saying to the judge through an interpreter, Your Honor, I don't have a lawyer, I don't have any money, just deport me back to my country, I give up. So notice how Tomas came seeking protection, and his asylum claim was actually never heard by the court. He spent so long in jail, he didn't have any help, his bond was so high, he simply gave up and went back. And so the US government never got a chance to say whether he deserved asylum or not, and he never really presented his claim. So that's one example. Tomas, started out with nothing and is essentially sent back with nothing to nothing. It's a bleak situation for so many people like Tomas. So the next example is again, based on a real case. I'll call this client Rick. Rick is from Russia, and he's a Jehovah's Witness. So recently, the Russian Supreme Court authorized the seizure of a lot of land and financial assets belonging to the Jehovah's Witnesses. This was my first case involving religious persecution of a Jehovah's Witness, so I learned a lot about their faith as part of the case. And apparently the Russian government does not appreciate the fact that they're pacifists, that they won't fight in national armies, and they don't generally participate in politics. So Rick is upper middle class. He owns a cell phone repair shop in Russia, realizes that he and his family aren't able to practice their religion safely anymore because of these crackdowns. But since he has the financial resources, he buys plane tickets, flies his family to Mexico. They present at the border just like Tomas did. And they're detained for a couple months. He's separated from his family members. They're taken to one detention center. He's taken to another. But because he has some financial resources, he's able to hire a lawyer. After a couple months, the lawyer gets him what's called parole. So he's able to leave detention without having to leave a monetary payment behind as a guarantee. And once he's released from the detention center and applying for asylum from outside of detention, his case goes on for years. In the real example, I think his final hearing on his asylum claim is now scheduled for 2022. So in the meantime, he's eligible to get a work permit. His family is also released from detention, and they're living together and worshiping together at a Jehovah's Witness temple here in Ohio. So notice neither Tomas's nor Rick's asylum claims were presented yet or were ever presented. But look at how different the outcomes are. Tomas spends a few weeks to a month in jail and gives up. Rick is living and working here legally, practicing his faith safely while he works with lawyers to prepare his case for his eventual trial date, which even if he's not granted asylum in 2022, could go on for a couple more years on appeal. So those are the first two examples. The third then is, I'll call him Harold. Harold is a Chinese businessman. He's very much upper class, owns some successful businesses in China, and the Chinese government comes to him and wants to use his businesses to launder money. He realizes that that's not something he wants to be involved in, that it's going to be dangerous to accept or refuse. Luckily, Harold and his kids and his sister have tourist visas from a previous trip to the US. Generally, a tourist visa is valid for many years. And so he and his family simply get on a plane and fly right to the United States with their existing tourist visas. They actually go on vacation. They go see, the Empire State Building, and they hang out with friends and family. And then they apply for asylum through an entirely different process. It's called an affirmative asylum application versus Tomas and Rick, who had to apply defensively because they were already in court proceedings. So Harold applies for asylum affirmatively. His case goes on for years without him ever seeing the inside of a detention center. And in fact, in the real example, he ends up marrying a United States citizen and getting a green card based on his marriage before he ever has a final trial date on his asylum application, which he then withdraws because he doesn't need it anymore. So you can see right away there are three very different outcomes for these three individuals. Tomas had no financial resources and really no education about the process to start with, and all he got for his trouble was a dangerous trip across Mexico and a few weeks in jail. Rick, is living safely in the US with his family now. He might go on to win asylum. If not, he's got maybe 4, 5, 6 years to live in the US with a valid work permit so he can make other plans for his life. And Harold gets a green card. He's a permanent resident without ever needing to proceed on his asylum claim, in large part because he started off with the financial resources to come here on a visa, to work with lawyers, to find a place to live, and he never sees the inside of a jail. So the lesson you can take away from this is, in the world of protective immigration, as in life in general, the amount of resources and savvy that you start out with are often determinative of the treatment you get by these structures that are ostensibly supposed to be impartial and fairly administer the law. So I want to take one step back and explain really quickly what is asylum and what is refugee status and why do these protections even exist? Because there's an excellent reason for why these protections exist. The devil, as they say, is in the details of how we implement them. So real quick, just on the terminology, a refugee is somebody who is compelled to leave their home country. So I am from Somalia, I get run out of my country, and I'm living in a UN refugee camp in Kenya. There's an international system administered by the United Nations and some other organizations that deals with refugees all over the world. They establish formal camps, they provide resources. There are government officials known as refugee officers who conduct interviews and background checks to make sure people are who they say they are and make sure they really qualify for asylum or refugee status. So when we say here in the US that someone is a refugee, we mean somebody who has been through that system, who has gone to a camp, been interviewed, been designated a refugee by the UN, and then been accepted for resettlement into the United States or into one of the other countries that accept refugees. Like Katie mentioned, the US has traditionally been one of the largest countries for accepting refugees. And I find it a source of pride as an Ohioan that Ohio is one of the top 3 states in the country who, until recently, accept large numbers of refugees. So that's what a refugee is, kind of generally in terms of terminology. An asylum seeker is somebody who is applying for protection in the country where they're seeking it. So refugee, I had to leave my home country, I go somewhere else, I apply for refugee status, and then I'm resettled into another country. An asylum seeker is I'm already in a country where I'm asking for protection and I'm applying to that country, please protect me. So one of the quirks of US asylum law is the only way you can apply for asylum in the United States is to already be here or to already be at the international border. And that's why people like Tomas couldn't just fill out an application in Guatemala City and mail it to the consulate. That's why he had to schlep all the way across Mexico, dealing with all kinds of human traffickers and kidnappers and organized crime, and come to the US border. There's no way for people outside of the US to apply for asylum status. So one of the major differences between asylum seekers and refugees is not what they're fleeing. Many of them are fleeing the same kinds of harm. The difference is where they're coming from and whether there's a camp for them to go to. So there are refugee camps all over Africa that are run by the United Nations. and that can process people into the international refugee system. Curiously, there are no UN refugee camps anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. There are very specific geopolitical reasons for that, having to do with the not in my backyard effect. But suffice it to say that people in Central America, they have no refugee camp they can go to and submit an application, which is why so many of them end up at the US southern border. That's the only way for them to apply for asylum. That is the quote unquote, the right way to immigrate and then ask for protection as an asylee. So the reason why we have these forms of protection takes us back to a little bit of the unsavory side of US history. The truth is that the US has never really been that great when it comes to protecting people from abroad who need protection. Anne Frank, had the US granted the visas her family applied for, could have been a 90-year-old woman in Brooklyn getting ready for Shabbat this weekend. And instead, she's a Pulitzer Prize winner, but posthumously so. She was murdered during the Holocaust. So when I give this presentation to undergrads, we spend a lot of time talking about the story of the MS St. Louis, which is something that I was never taught in school, and I'm sure a lot of other people were not taught this part of the history. But basically, in 1939, a ship called the MS St. Louis left Hamburg and had about 900 Jewish refugees on board. 1939 is right when World War II is about to break out in its most extreme form. And so reading some of the interviews from the passengers on the MS St. Louis, they were convinced that they had made it to the last sort of ship to safety, the last flight out of Dodge, so to speak. And they were ecstatic that they were escaping Europe. So they sail all the way across the Atlantic, thinking that they had just basically escaped the Holocaust. And they get to Cuba, where they had valid visas to arrive. Unbeknownst to them, while they were en route crossing the Atlantic, the Cuban government canceled all of their visas, so that when the ship got to Cuba, the Cubans said, "Nope, sorry, you can't come to port here. You can't land. Stay in the ocean." They turned around and went to both the United States and Canada seeking protection for the Jewish passengers on board, and they were turned away by both countries. Secretary of State Cordell Hull essentially told Roosevelt, "Listen, don't let these people in the U.S." The Canadian Prime Minister also was kind of anti-Jewish immigration at the time. And so, horrifyingly enough, this ship with 900 Jews on it had to turn around and sail back across the Atlantic to Europe in 1939. And later scholarship revealed that about a third of them were murdered in extermination camps during the Holocaust. So the international community was rightly ashamed and horrified that this had happened, that we literally sent 900 people back to Europe in 1939 when a third of them were destined for German concentration camps. So in some ways, to the credit of the international community, they came up with the International Refugee Convention. So fast forward a couple of years, World War II is over. You've got Woodrow Wilson, the League of Nations, the UN, all of that happening. And so 1951, the international community enacts the Convention relating to the status of refugees. And the language is very clear. You can see it right there in the left-hand column. No contracting state, no party to this convention can send a refugee back to a country where his or her life or freedom would be threatened. Now, you would think that that's an extremely clear promulgation, right? You cannot send people back to countries where their lives or freedom are threatened. But as I said a minute ago, the devil is in the details, which I'll get to on the next slide. The United States, unfortunately, is not a global leader in this area. It took us about another 16 years to join the Refugee Convention, which we did by ratifying the Refugee Protocol in 1967. The United States Constitution makes international treaties the supreme law of the land. They have the force of the Constitution and of federal law, and that's our Article 6 right there on the right. So essentially, we have a very clear international commitment. It is illegal for us to send people to countries where their lives or freedom are threatened. Well, to understand why such a clear edict in practice is so complicated in implementation, we have to look quickly at the structure of the US government. So rewind briefly to Civics 101, right? Here's a real simple org chart of the US government. And there are three major branches of government: the executive, which is the president, the legislature, which is Congress, and the judiciary, which is the Supreme Court and the subordinate federal courts. So on the far left of the slide, under the executive branch, you can see all of the different federal agencies that make up the executive. The two most relevant examples for immigration purposes are the Justice Department, and Homeland Security. And the immigration courts in the US are actually part of the Department of Justice. So on the far right, you've got the judicial branch of government. You've got the Supreme Court. We've got the 13 US courts of appeals, the different district courts. When you go to immigration court and when you file appeals from immigration judges' decisions, you are not acting within the judicial branch of government. This is all part of the executive branch. And in fact, it's under the control of the Attorney General, who's appointed by the president. So federal judges who serve in district courts are appointed by the president. They're confirmed by the Senate. They have life tenure. Immigration judges, you actually can go to usajobs.gov right now and apply to be a U.S. immigration judge. And you're essentially an employee of the Attorney General. And I think this goes a long way to explaining why a lot of the courts and judges involved in making immigration policy in the US are really more a policy wing of the administration than an impartial judicial adjudicator. There's a lot of politics that goes into immigration litigation, and most lawyers agree it really shouldn't be this way. There's been a movement for years to take the immigration courts out of the Justice Department and put them into the judiciary, make them their own sort of court of appeals, their own circuit. But of course, that would take an act of Congress, which, as we've seen over the last few legislative sessions, is very little inclined to do much of anything but argue with each other. So understanding that a lot of the agencies that deal with immigration policy are essentially political rather than adjudicatory, we can now see why things get so complicated in practice. I'm not going to go over this whole slide because, as you can see, it's extremely complicated. But when I do this presentation for immigration lawyers and law students, we can spend about 2 hours going over all the different steps in this process for how someone gets to the border and then gets to claim asylum. I just want to show this to illustrate the interplay between the real federal court system, the judicial branch of government, and the policymaking institutions, because I happen to think immigration law is probably one of the most interesting and dynamic areas of law to practice, because there are federal court injunctions coming down all the time that are essentially changing what your active clients are eligible to apply for. So for example, there was a recent injunction called Miss L v. ICE, which had to do with family separation. There's one called Davis versus Nielsen, which has to do with people who ask for permission to enter the US at a bridge rather than cross through the desert. There's Alfaro Garcia versus Johnson, which says you should only have to wait 10 days to get a reasonable fear interview. There's Grace versus Whitaker, which has to do with negative credible fear reviews and whether attorney general decisions are binding on those reviews. There's Padilla versus ICE, which has to do with the amount of bond that federal courts or that immigration courts can set and what reasonable amounts are. There's Hernandez versus Sessions, which also has to do with how the court should consider your ability to post bond and setting those bond amounts. Then there's a permanent nationwide injunction called Orantes, which has to do with special treatment for Salvadoran citizens who had previously been deceived about their rights to apply for asylum. So there's all kinds of federal court injunctions coming down all the time that affect this entire process. And that's why I think immigration law is one of the most complex areas that you could possibly practice in. And it's one where the stakes are the highest for your clients. I mean, some of these cases are literally life and death. So I want to give you just a couple examples of how these cases play out in practice. And one of them is a case involving a woman who in court filings is referred to as ACM. This is a case of a woman who was captured by Salvadoran rebels during the Civil War. She basically watched them murder her husband. She had to dig his grave. She was enslaved for decades and forced to cook and clean for this rebel group before she finally escaped and applied for asylum in the US. And her request for asylum was denied because the judge said that work that you provided, cooking and cleaning as a slave for this rebel organization, was material support to a terrorist group. And so because you have supported terrorism, you are not eligible for asylum in the US. Now, if we back up to the MS St. Louis, clearly the international community in 1951 was trying to preserve the lives of people who were desperately fleeing for their safety. And here we have an example of a woman who's clearly desperately fleeing for her safety. And our adjudicatory system comes up with a way to nevertheless deny her asylum by saying, well, you provided material support to terrorism by working as a domestic slave for this terrorist group. So right away, you can see how the implementation of immigration policy, when it's done by a policy wing of the administration instead of an impartial court, leads to these absurd results that really aren't what the framers of the Refugee Convention could have intended or envisioned. And what we see now is what some organizations are calling the weaponization of the immigration court. So the Attorney General, Bill Barr, who's responsible for all the immigration judges, has been deliberately promoting judges with very high asylum denial rates to the Board of Immigration Appeals. And again, public records and FOIA requests have shown that this is a deliberate strategy on the part of the Department of Justice to put judges with the most restrictive views of asylum in appellate leadership positions. The other quirk of immigration law is that the Attorney General can himself just issue decisions on certain cases. So he can take a decision that's been made by a judge, that's been affirmed by a board, and say, hey, send this case my way, I want to weigh in on it myself. And the last two attorneys general, Jeff Sessions and Bill Barr, have done this at a level that we have never seen before. So you essentially have a one-man Supreme Court, an unelected attorney general, who is deciding the fate of millions of asylum seekers, who, frankly, I believe the international community intended to protect, and who the US is very diabolically and cleverly finding ways to deny protection. I want to tell you one quick story before I conclude, because I know I've been talking for a long time. This is a story about a kid named Reynaldo. Reynaldo, like Tomas, was a young man growing up in Guatemala. He was trying to escape criminal gangs there. He made it out of Guatemala, made it to the US. And for whatever reason, when it was his turn to go to court in Philadelphia, he was not there for his court hearing. Luckily, he had a very good judge, Judge Stephen Morley of the Philadelphia Immigration Court, who looked at the file and said, you know, I'm not convinced that this kid got the notice that he was supposed to be here. The address looks weird. I'm not going to order him deported for not coming. I'm just going to set this case aside because I don't think he knew he was supposed to be here. Well, so Judge Morley does what's called administratively closes the case. He says, just set this one aside. I can't prove that this kid knew about it. We're going to just forget about this for now. The government then appeals that decision. It goes all the way up to the Attorney General, who says, hey, judges just don't have that power anymore. You have to decide all the cases, yes or no. You can't just set them aside as a docket management tool. You can't administratively close cases anymore. That's a huge change. It affects, I think it affected at the time something like 800,000 cases that were administratively closed. And sure enough, despite the fact that the administration came into office saying it wanted to decrease the backlog in the immigration courts, it's actually increased it from 800,000 to I think 1.3 million. But to make Reynaldo's story worse, so the case goes up to the Attorney General on appeal. The Attorney General says, nope, Judge, you can't do that. You have to make a decision on this kid's case, whether he's there or not. The case goes back to the judge. The judge holds a hearing, says, look, he's not here. I'm still not convinced that he got this letter saying he should come to court. One of the local immigration attorneys said, Judge, give me some time. Let me see if I can find this kid and bring him to court. And the judge says, sure, fine. I'll give you a continuance. I'm still not going to order him removed. Go see if you can find him. The government then appealed that decision, and the Department of Justice took Judge Morley off the case, replaced him with a different judge who issued a deportation order from Reynaldo, and then they went right back to their prior docket. So it's not just the case that the Justice Department has a huge amount of power when it comes to deciding these cases. It's also that they don't play fair, as if having every advantage in the world is not already enough. When you tell other lawyers that this kind of stuff goes on, they're sometimes incredulous, and that's why I like to show the actual headlines to show that yes, these shenanigans really happen. So the Department of Justice can play musical chairs with immigration judges when it doesn't like the decisions that it gets. Really quick, I want to close with the story of these 5 families. We call them the Fab Five. They were families I worked with when I was managing a pro bono project down in the border back in 2015. These were all families who came to the US with their kids seeking asylum, and they were detained at the government calls it the South Texas Family Residential Center. We call it baby jail. It's a giant, essentially, detention center full of women and kids. So these 5 families, they were denied asylum. Their cases were on appeal. The government wouldn't let them out. If you add up the number of days that they spent in detention, it adds up to 6 years. Now, as a whole, they were only in detention, I think, 5 or 6 months, but when you total the number of days for each individual, it's 6 years. Back then, they were estimating that the cost was maybe $150 per person per day to fund this detention center. So you and I, the American taxpayers, paid $250,000 to put these people in jail. Now let's see what else we could have done with that, right? If any of you are undergrads watching this, then you know tuition is not cheap. Back in 2015, when I first created this slide, the average cost of tuition at a private college was 32 grand. So if we assume that number for purposes of calculation, we could have put all 5 of these kids through 4 years of private college and still had $160,000 left over for housing assistance and vocational training for their moms. And instead, we as a society made the value judgment that we would rather spend that $250,000 paying a private detention company to build these giant prison camps in the desert and lock these families up. I happen to think that's the wrong value judgment to make, but that's why we have elections, right? And there's one right around the corner. Katie mentioned earlier that the U.S. takes lots more international refugees than any other country, and it's unfortunate right now that as the need grows globally for protection from wars in Syria and Yemen, gang wars in Central America, coups in Venezuela and Nicaragua, not just the US, but other developed countries are also cracking down and making it harder for people to get asylum. We now have the combined population of Texas and California globally who are internally displaced refugees, asylum seekers seeking protection. That's about 64 million people. And in light of this unprecedented need, the international community, developed nations are, instead of opening up and saying, we'll take more, they're cracking down and making it harder and taking fewer and fewer people, which I think is exactly the wrong response. And when you put this in the context of 1951 and the Refugee Convention and the MS St. Louis, it should become clear that the values that we were espousing in enacting the Refugee Convention, that we owed it to these people to preserve human life when they were fleeing danger, have become so diluted in our current policy that I think when it comes to the way that we adjudicate asylum cases and the way our immigration court systems work in general, it's more a question of a system that just needs to be torn down and rebuilt from the beginning. And as if all the things I've said so far aren't bad enough, we are now dealing with the COVID pandemic, which, despite the fact that we haven't seen something on this scale in 100 years, literally 100 years, the immigration courts and detention centers are essentially treating it as business as usual. They're still having hearings. I have clients who are in the Seneca County Jail who never have access to masks, who don't have enough soap. I'm sure Katie and Maria have clients who have similar experiences just with inadequate detention conditions. So 10 days away from an election at a time when things could not be higher stakes and could not be worse in this country for the most vulnerable people, the people who need our protection the most. I think it was Gandhi who said something about you can judge a society by how it treats its most vulnerable members. And so I would just encourage everybody in casting your vote to consider how you think America should treat the most vulnerable members of our global human society. And that's with that, I'll wrap it up. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. I know we're going to do questions at the end, but there's one question that might be good for you to answer now because it relates particularly to your PowerPoint. So the slide when you were talking about the 3 cases and how they were different, somebody wants to know because they were from different countries, if that will make a difference, if they had all been from the same country, or is it just because they're from one particular country that it made it easier for them?
So I get this is the typical lawyer answer, right? Yes and no. It's not so much the country that you come from, it's whether you have a way to get into the US without having to walk up to the border. So if Tomas had been a very wealthy upper middle class Guatemalan and got a tourist visa, yeah, he probably would have had a much better, easier time applying for asylum. Because asylum adjudications are more of a policy pronouncement by the administration than a legal determination, there is some statistical favoritism. There's great research done by Syracuse University in particular has a center called the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse. And they publish all kinds of analyses of Freedom of Information Act data. And so basically, if you are a Chinese Christian, your claim is because you're being persecuted for your Christianity, those are probably the easiest asylum cases to win. Whereas if you're Central American and you're fleeing gang violence, those are probably the hardest. So it has something to do with the background conditions in your country, but mostly it's just the resources you start out with. If you have enough money to get a plane ticket instead of walking, if you can hire an attorney, if you have family in the US who can provide you with a place to stay, it just, the more you start out with, the further you get in this Byzantine bizarre system.
Thanks, Ryan. So next, we have Hulithia, who is the president of the Mauritanian Network for Human Rights. She's also a community leader in Columbus. So she's going to tell us a little bit about her work, what she's doing with the Mauritanian community, as well as some of the issues that she is interested in regards to immigration. Go ahead, Hula.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you, Abel, for hosting this panel. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm honored to be one of the participants or the panelists of this webinar. My name is Hule Cham, and I came to the US in the early 2001, to be specific. I'm a community activist. I'm also a social worker. I just started dealing with immigration a few years ago, around 2017, 2018. When the Mauritanian communities members started being, riled up and put in plans and deported back to Mauritania, basically. Under a little background about Mauritania. Mauritania is a country in West Africa. If you never heard of it, it's between Senegal and Morocco. And we have two main components of the population. We have the Arabic or Arab lighter skin Mauritanians who's had the power since we got our independence in 1960. And then we have Black Mauritanians who are also divided in two categories. There's the Haptanis, which are ex-slaves, and some of them are still slaves to this day in some part of the country, although not all. And then there's a different component of the Black population, the Afro-Mauritanians, which are the Fulanis, the Wolofs, the Soninkes, which are not slaves, but are still a second-class citizen in the country. And since 1960 to this day, Mauritania has not been stable because we've had a system of discrimination that has discriminated against every Black person. If you're not a slave, you are a second-class citizen. In 1986, 30 Black Mauritanians wrote a book called The Manifesto of the Oppressed Black Mauritanian. And they were able to publish that book outside of the country just to talk about the disparities between the races in Mauritania and how every bank in the country was owned by white or Arab Mauritanians, how the wealth was in between their hands, how the presidency, of course, and all the higher post officials were given to one race. And once the president was outside of the country at a state dinner, he talked about apartheid in South Africa, and then one of the presidents told him, you have nothing to say because you have the same thing in your country. And when he came back, he was pissed off, he was furious. He took all of the authors of that book, including my dad, who was one of the main authors, and they were put in jail for 4 years and they were tortured. That was in 86. In 87, 88, there were again, killings of the militaries. In the 90s, there were 500 militaries that were killed just simply because they were Black, and the government felt threatened because they were in the military. In the 90s, 100,000 Mauritanians were deported. Black Mauritanians, mostly Fulani, of the Fulani ethnic group, were deported to Senegal and Mali, which are the neighboring countries. Some people that were deported to Senegal were able to come back. Some are still there, and the people that were deported to Mali never made it back home. So this is just in a nutshell what's going on as far as human rights abuse, including slavery in some part of the country in Mauritania to this day. The governments keep changing and they keep promising that things are going to change, but at the root cause of the discrimination system, the structure is still there for one ethnic group to be at the top and for everyone else to just serve them. That's why Mauritanians leave. And oftentimes when I talk, I say immigration is often not a choice. Immigration is not an adventure. It's not a vacation. People don't leave wives sometimes, husbands sometimes, children sometimes, childhood friends, cousins, pack and leave to start all over at 20, 30, 40, sometimes 50, in a whole new country where you don't speak the language, you don't know the culture, you don't know what's awaiting you, and sometimes jail time is part of what's awaiting you just because you want to be there. When people come here, oftentimes it's because they're running away from something that's bigger than themselves. And then it's because they're seeking safety. No one wants to come here illegally, and that includes Mauritanians. So getting back to the Mauritanian community, again, under Trump, under Trump, people started getting deported, but before that, even Mauritanians who lost their asylum cases were not being deported because they know what's going on in Mauritania, and the State Department knows. Excuse me, my light went off. The State Department here knows exactly all of human rights abuse because it's very well researched. That when these people are deported, they might very well face every kind of abuse, including slavery. So even people who were not accepted as far as the asylum case were able to remain in this country and do what they call the ICE check-ins, where they will go and check in with ICE once a year, get a social security number and a car and the unemployment and the driver's license to be able to remain here to work, even though they cannot travel, and it's a very restricted life, because who wants to live like that? You're here, you have no path to citizenship, and you cannot travel outside of the country, but at least you're here, you're able to live safely and work here. When Trump came into the picture and into power in 2017, 16, that changed, pretty much that changed. And of course, just like every other immigrant group in this country, Mauritanians got their part too. All of a sudden, people who went to ICE check-ins didn't come out. People who had, of course, wives and Muslim men and children left families in disarray. People who went to ICE check-in got put into charter planes and deported to Mauritania. And often when they got to Mauritania, the country did not even recognize them as Mauritanian citizens because they've been here for so long, and there's been a new registration with the Mauritanian government in 2011, and if you don't have those latest papers, basically they don't think of you as a Mauritanian. So what we've heard was that the Trump administration threatened to put Mauritania on a Muslim ban if they don't start issuing travel documents. You cannot deport someone from here unless they have a travel document. And in 2017, again, the Mauritanian embassy started issuing what they call a laissez-passer, which is a travel document, to be able to have ICE deport those people back to Mauritania. But once they got there, of course, the government did not recognize them as citizens. So they went from the airport to jail. They went from their homes here to jails, to detention centers, from the detention centers to charter planes to Mauritania, from the charter planes to Mauritania at the airport to another jail in Mauritania until they check out who they are, which is something else that's ridiculous. Finally, some of them that were able to get out, to bribe the guards and get out, had to immigrate again into the neighboring countries. Some of them are still in jail to this day. So as far as my activism, again, I just started seeing people disappear. I started seeing families coming and asking questions in tears. I started seeing children who haven't seen their dads in 6 months, and just seeing how wrong this was in so many levels. And that's all it was to me, standing up with my community against this wrongdoing. I did not call it activism. I didn't call it organizing. I just knew that this was wrong, and these people needed, advocacy, and they needed information, and they needed to know their rights. So we did some Know Your Rights organizations events where we tell people what to do if ICE knocks on your door, if you go on that ICE check-in, what you should plan to do in case you don't come out, because you might very well not come out. We started talking to lawyers, trying to see if they could help people, accompany them to their ICE check-ins. We started talking to citizens who were also afraid because there was just so much fear in the community. The Mauritanian network got created in 2018 because although we had a very well, widespread support from the community, because there's a lot of Mauritanians, especially here in Ohio. We have about 3,000 right here in Columbus, and we have about another 2,000 to 3,000 in Cincinnati. And when we started seeing this, we reached out to our neighbors, which are our brothers and sisters, Ohioans, because we live here. People that were affected by that wave of deportations were here often for 15, 20 years. And Some of them have bought homes, paid taxes, had retirements waiting for them. They deported a man who had a pancreatic cancer, who's been here, who's 65, who has paid into the system here, retirement system, for 20 years. He's now starting all over at 65 and sick in Mauritania. And that's if he makes it out of jail. That's just one example of how cruel this is. So the Mauritanian network got created in 2018 because we've seen the widespread support, but we also needed to organize our community to be able to be at the forefront of the struggle. Advocacy needed to be there, education needed to be there. We needed to assist our people, which are mostly illiterate, mostly don't speak the language, to be able to let them know what to do in this case, on that case. We need to support families that were, again, in disarray. And one story that keeps coming back to my mind every time I talk about this is the fact that there was one time when we went to a law office. We went to see Joyce Bailey, because that was something else we needed to organize around. We needed to reach out to our lawmakers, elected officials, because it's not all Mauritanians that cannot vote. Some of us can vote, and there's a big voting block, but we needed to let those around us, including the elected officials, know that we're here and we have a voice to be told, we have a story to be told, and we have needs to be met. So we went to see Joyce Berry to tell her about the deportation crisis, to tell her about how many Mauritanians live here and how many were in her district and what we needed if she wanted us to vote for her. And there was he was a real estate agent, and he's like, he said, I want to talk, and they gave him, of course, the mic. And he said, I'm not an organizer, I'm not an activist, I'm a real estate agent. He said, I sell homes, that's what I do. He said, but this person who got torn apart from his family that I had sold home to had become my brother. I don't care if he's an asylum seeker, I don't care if he's a refugee, I don't care if he's here undocumented. He became my brother because that's the kind of relationship we had. And it's wrong for anyone to tear him apart from his family and send him to jail or send him back to a country that might not recognize him. He said, again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an activist, I'm a salesperson, but I'm here and willing to do anything I can to stand with you all, to fight this fight, and to stand with this family to fight this fight. And that's what we need from everyone who's listening on this call tonight. There's so much wrongdoing, and hopefully this is going to be over soon in the next election. But what I'm asking for people is to be informed and to stand with immigrants, to learn their stories, and to work with them as much as possible, to tell their stories, to stand with them, to talk about how wrong this is. It's wrong in two folds. In one fold is how people jump through so many hoops to get here, and then when they get here, the whole immigration system, when we say it's designed for immigrants, but when you look at it very closely, and this is just what Brian was presenting about, it's designed for asylum seekers without asylum seekers. It's actually designed to punish, if you look at it. If you sometimes I translate for the Credible Fear interviews. They ask the same person who doesn't have this culture, who doesn't know what's going on, who doesn't speak the language. Of course, they use translators, which is a whole different issue. But it's designed to trick. They ask you the same question 20 million times, trying for you to answer that question just slightly so they could trick you and say you failed. And they intimidate you, especially if it's the ICE officers. They yell sometimes. It's just wrong in so many ways. So the Mauritanian network, again, was created in 2018. We did some work around, of course, supporting the families, connecting them to lawyers, connecting with elected officials, letting them, in Ohio especially, letting them know that we're here and what our needs are. We did a lot of work, especially this year, around the census 2020, because our population are part of the population that are called the hard to count, because, again, a lot of the Mauritanian community don't speak the language, they don't understand it. Sometimes when that census letter comes, they put it in the trash because they don't know what it is. So we did a lot of work around that, as far as translating, letting people know what census questions are and why the census was important in translating those into Mauritanian national languages to make sure people know exactly what it is and how important it is and how important it is to fill it out. Some people from the Mauritanian network became census takers. Some people were available by phone if people needed assistance. I mean, of course, we were ready to assist people in their homes to not to fill it out for them, but at least to let them know what the information was. But the COVID happened, so we no longer were able to do that. And we did a lot of work around the COVID-19 because there was a lot of misinformation about it, what it was, how to contract it, whether it was real or not, whether it was a flu. And of course, we had the governor's press conferences that were very helpful, but they were all in English, so people didn't speak the language. So we made sure that at least one of us was able to listen, to be able to translate it and put it in audio format. And again, it's part of a culture of this country where everything is written down, everything is documentation, everything is, through the mail. But if you don't read and write, that's no help to you. So we had to shift this whole culture of writing things down and giving it to people to an oral format, an audio format, to be able to translate everything into an audio format. We also made sure that we did what we call the immigrant neighborhood, the immigrant in your neighborhood, where we told people about, again, our presence here and why we're here, and why it is important for our voices to be heard, and why it is important for Ohioans to know that there's people in their backyards that are going through what my community is going through. And we did like some events where we talk about the reason why people leave in Mauritania in the first place, and why it's so important for people to call their elected officials and let them know that while the State Department knows all of the human rights abuse that's going on in Mauritania and why people leave, they still have a relationship with Mauritania. Mauritania is still getting foreign aid. Actually, they're getting more money now than before because they've been told that they are doing a good job fighting terrorism in the West African region, that Mali, Mauritania, Senegal corridor, where they're saying Mauritania is doing a good job. So they're giving people more, the Mauritanian government more money to fight terrorism just so they could turn around and terrorize their own people. The US as a country and the values that we hold and we should hold should not be doing any business or any relationship with any country that still has slavery in the 21st century. And when I say slavery, I mean slavery, people owning people. When you look at the Mauritanian constitution, they will tell you they abolished slavery in 1981. But when people who live there know that that's not correct. Their whole strategy is to deny and lie and write things in a way that they look good on the international eye. But when you live in the country, those who leave slavery know it. Again, it's not every Black Mauritanian who's a slave, but there are still slaves in Mauritania. Again, the system of the governance in the country has not changed a bit. They keep changing the people, but the structure, the racism is still there. And we think with just a little bit of pressure from the international world, there's a way to change this. I love my country, but the government has to do the right thing. And at this point, they are not doing the right thing. People are being humiliated, targeted, put in prison for any reason, and banned from demonstrating. And it's just like, it gets worse with every president. And every time we have hope, it does not happen. And all we're asking is for elected officials to look at Mauritania as a country, look at what they're doing in terms of human rights abuse, to make sure that they're pressuring them so that at least people that are there are able to stay there. Because if people have peace in their countries, if they have food on the table, if they're safe, they don't need to be here. Again, coming here is not often a choice. It's something that people do because they have to do it. And with a little help, people want to remain in their home countries. I know I've been talking a minute, so I'm going to stop here. And if there's any other further questions, I will come back and answer them.
Thank you. And yeah, I really appreciate all the work you've done for the Mauritanian community. I know you've been like a leader to try to make sure that they get representation, especially after they were detained. And so I think we can all now talk. I'm going to ask some questions that I have, and also I'm going to use a couple from the Q&A. But this one is for all of you. So if all of you want to answer, or whoever wants to answer, I want to ask you, what is a local issue that relates to immigration that is affecting like immigrants in Ohio particularly, whether it is like Katie was talking about law enforcement, or maybe detention, or maybe how the court works here, because each court is a little different, and thanks to their judges, and how ICE works in Ohio. So what's one issue that you see that it's affecting immigrants in Ohio particularly? Whoever wants to answer.
I can jump in just with an initial thought, which is, and this is probably something everyone else would agree with, access to counsel is a huge problem. There is this fiction that you can get through the immigration system without a lawyer. So the Supreme Court case Gideon versus Wainwright, which created the right to counsel, applies only in criminal cases. So if you're charged with a misdemeanor and you can't afford a lawyer, the government provides one for you. In immigration court, those are considered civil proceedings, which means there are no immigration public defenders. There's no appointed attorneys. You either have to be lucky enough to get one of the very few pro bono attorneys like the three of us, or you have to have a lot of money to be able to hire private counsel. And so I work in a few different states, and I think some of the states where there's been large immigrant populations that have been more active historically, they have more nonprofits, they have more pro bono lawyers, they have kind of more programs than Ohio does. And I know that our different organizations are all working to kind of close the gap, but it is just so hard to get a lawyer in Ohio if you don't have a lot of money to hire a private attorney. And I've been at different nonprofits where the waiting list is like 4 months long, even to get an initial intake appointment. And then a lot of times they can't take your case anyway for funding reasons or timing reasons. So I would love to see if there are lots of up and coming ambitious young law students out there who want to be immigration lawyers and join us at the various nonprofits. We need a lot more lawyers who are willing to do this for a lot less money than the private bar does.
Yeah, and I'll jump. I know I asked the question, but because Brian brought a topic that I really wanted to bring out, so I'll let other people answer my original question. But I just wanted to give some facts that I looked up this morning, because so there's two data points, and so I'm going to give both. One says that about 60% of people in immigration proceedings overall have representation, and about between 20 and 30 of those are people in detention. Another one says it's less. Another one is more or less about 40% of all people in remote proceedings have attorneys, and only 14 of those in detention have attorneys. And based on my experience and Brian's experience, a lot of people in detention, especially in Ohio, do not have an attorney. There's not that many private attorneys taking detention cases, and very few of us nonprofits that take detain cases. So what he's saying is really important, because this immigration system is very confusing. If you don't speak the language, you have to figure out how to file your own forms. So you don't get an interpreter for that. So usually people in detention, for example, help you fill it out, somebody who's detained with you. So yeah, that's a big issue, not just in the country, but I think in Ohio particularly. And we can go back to my question from before about a local issue. I think Katie she unmuted herself. So I think she was gonna answer.
Oh, I was just going to say something, and I don't have the great statistics that Maria has to back this up, but I think a lot of people on this call, on speakers, would agree. One of the big things that's affecting, I think, my clients at the local level throughout Ohio is the aggressive nature of our local ICE field office, and I mean the larger one that oversees Michigan and Ohio. And on top of that, even though we have a really great, robust series of immigrant communities, refugee communities in Ohio, we still have a relatively small population compared to a lot of other states. Yet if you look at the data about people who have no criminal records who are being apprehended, I mean, Julio just talked about the Mauritanians who have been going to check-ins for years and have no additional criminal issues or anything like that, and are getting apprehended in the middle of their yearly check-ins while their wife and kids are waiting at home for them to come home like they did every year. I mean, we've really seen aggressive enforcement, and part of that's probably because we don't have as many people crossing the border by Ohio, or have any really. I mean, there's this theory that people are swimming across Lake Erie that necessitates the need for a border patrol station in Sandusky Bay, but I won't get into that too much. But I think that and on top of that, so we've got this like local in the the Cincinnati ERO field office, the enforcement removal operations in Blue Ash, and then even up in Michigan for some people who work in Northern Ohio. We've got this like aggressive local nature, and we also have a a federal administration that is giving them control. It's providing very little oversight. I had a client who was ordered removed in 2012 and had checked in. She has 4 US citizen children. She's from Mexico, had checked in every year since 2012. 2 of her children have medical conditions. And every year under the old administration, she's been allowed to just return. She's provided no criminal issues, nothing, to muck up her record at all. And in 2016, she came in, and this field office in Columbus really did not like her. I mean, to this day, I believe they just had a personal vendetta. When I first got, they just hated her. And we filed a stay of removal, and it was denied in 2016, but it was appealed up to DC, and somebody at DC had the oversight authority to say, you know what, this person has some really good things in her favor. She needs to be able to stay for another year. But then when we came back in 2017, same client, same family situation, the local field office said, or the local ERO office said, nope, she's not getting it. And there was no way to appeal it up to DC like there was. They just didn't hear it. I mean, we tried. So there's just a lot more free reign around here. And it's unfortunate for us in Ohio because we have a very aggressive ICE office, overseeing our removal operations.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, Maria, that there's also this issue with language access, which you mentioned, I believe, earlier. My organization helps with translation, especially in African languages. Like there's a nice structure with Spanish, but if you don't speak Spanish or French, the major languages, and then basically it's so hard to find you an interpreter. And again, the Mauritanian network worked with attorneys trying to do free translation for attorneys, because if you can't communicate with the detainee, you can't represent them. You have to be able to talk to the person. And there are different Fulani versions in Africa. Sometimes they get the wrong interpreter at the hearing, and the person can barely understand what they're saying, and the judge is saying, well, we got you an interpreter and it's Fulani, because the judges don't have the cultural knowledge that they need to be able to represent these people. And they don't have the necessary country condition knowledge that they need to be able to accurately represent these people. And thirdly, there's people coming here with such a great amount of trauma coming to this country because of what they went through in their home country, but also when they get here, what they go through filing asylum, what if they're outside, if they're detained. And we're seeing a lot more Mauritanians crossing the southern border now. This is pretty new for my community, but we've seen more and more of that happening. And that's even worse because they get isolated, they get mistreated, the officials, ICE officials get frustrated because of course they don't speak the language. Sometimes you have to wait hours just to get an interpreter. Sometimes you have to get a volunteer interpreter. So language access is another huge thing that's impacting not only detained individuals, but also the attorneys that are trying to help them, because it's so hard to find someone to assist that. And to go back to what Brian was saying earlier about lack of counsel, again, just yesterday I had 5 people that I'm trying to look for attorneys for. A couple of them are in Arizona, one is in Mississippi, one is in Virginia. I can't. Everyone is booked, and lawyers are tired of pro bono. They want to make some money, and they are absolutely right. These people are not criminals in the criminal system here or in the law. There's no law to assist people in immigration get a universal representation, which they should be, because someone who doesn't. I have 2 master's degrees, and I cannot navigate this law, the U.S. law and the immigration system by myself. Imagine someone who cannot read or write, who had just gotten here, has been in jail for 10 months, has tremendous amount of trauma going on. How is that person expected to go through the system and win? Basically, the odds are stacked against them from the get-go, and it's just wrong.
Yes, I agree. The issue with interpretation is a big deal. We had a question about that from the Q&A about the languages that Immigration Court has to provide, and they technically are supposed to provide all of them. Normally, the only one that they have in person is Spanish, but like who would say, like there's sometimes indigenous languages or languages from countries that don't have as many people here in the US, and even the court has a hard time finding those. Or the person, I've seen it for example, with the Guatemalan community, they just say they speak Spanish and might speak an indigenous language, because they know that they might take longer to get their hearings, or they might have an, the court might give them, a hard time because they can't find an interpreter for that indigenous language for that particular region. So, and that happens, across the world with different languages and from different countries. So that is a big issue, not just for detained people, but outside, because while they're in court, they'll get an interpreter, but while they're working on their case that they have to do themselves, if they're pro se, nobody's gonna help them with that. And I do wanna say, so our office, ABLE, we have a lot of attorneys that do immigration work, whether it's detained or not detained, we have a lot of people. And we get our funding from different sources. Like, for example, my detention work is done based on the city of Columbus did a funding that it was also started thanks to the Vera Institute of Justice that I know Hula is working on to try to help people, try to encourage city councils and city local governments to kind of putting money into representation. Because there are a lot of us doing this work, but not enough, in the whole state. And I know Hula is involved now in universal representation advocacy. So I don't know if you want to talk about that, why universal representation is important, and why it's,
sure.
yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. I mentioned it earlier, again, universal representation is important because it's just a question of fairness and giving people a fair shot that are here to this country. Again, US law says if you are being targeted in your country because of race, sexual orientation, or gender, you can present yourself or you fly here, find a way to get here, and you could seek asylum. That's US law. So don't tell me that people that cross the border are illegals or are breaking the law. If you're presenting yourself at the border and you're seeking asylum, you're not, as far as I know, breaking any law. So if you say this is what we stand for, these are the values we have as a country, if you're being targeted, you could come and seek asylum and we're giving you a fair shot. Universal representation is part of that fair shot. If not, if you asking again someone who doesn't speak the language, does not read or write, telling that person to navigate the immigration system is failing that person from the get-go, is stacking the odds against that person from the get-go. But at least if you give them an attorney, you give them counsel to work with them, then the government always has counsel. The government lawyer always is ready when they get there, whether the person has a lawyer or not. So it's just a question of fairness, a question of value, a question of giving that person a fair shot at making their case, is to give a representation. So universal representation is way overdue in this country. And I mean, not just in Ohio. I mean, of course, we're starting with Ohio because that's where we live, especially in Columbus, which hopefully City Council is gonna work with us on this, because this is tremendously needed. Again, there's few people just yesterday and today that I'm working with, and I've called every list on the LOP hotline, and I've called different lawyers. I cannot find lawyers for these people. And it's not just universal representation for people in jails. Fine, if you hopefully get a lawyer from a nonprofit, which are hugely overstretched. And the volunteers in my organization, again, we volunteer to do translation on top of full-time jobs, on top of organizing, on top of people calling you all day asking different questions. You just can't do it all. So we just need the government to give us a little push to be able to help these people who are already here and who are just trying to live here safely, make a decent living, and contribute to this country.
Yeah, and I think it's also about getting a fair shot. I mean, when I was looking at data today about access to counsel, one thing that also came up was that of people who had to do their cases on their own between 2007 and 2012, 5% of those people were successful in their cases in the whole country. For the people who finished their cases during that time, if they didn't have an attorney, just because how hard it is for somebody to try to figure out how to go through the system and figure it out. I mean, I know I say a lot about detention, but because it's in detention, it's just you have a shorter amount of time to try to figure everything out, and you are far away from anybody that you might know. It's even harder, but this includes people who were also non-detained. So this is just a general number. Instead, if you see the numbers of people who have attorneys, their successful rates are exponentially higher because of that. So kind of along those lines. Oh, go ahead, Ryan.
I want to add one more point, which is the reason universal representation is so important is also because representing somebody in an asylum case takes a lot more than just the lawyer. You know, if I meet somebody in a detention center and I say, fine, I will take your case 100% for free, you pay nothing, I still need to hire an interpreter and sometimes a clinician to do a mental health evaluation and somebody to help with research on country conditions. So it's really expensive to litigate these cases even when the lawyer isn't charging anything. And I think we're very fortunate in Ohio that we do have a lot of social workers and people with various language skills who are willing to volunteer their time. But it is sort of like a jigsaw puzzle sometimes and providing pro bono representation where you say, all right, I'll do the legal part for free, but I need a way to communicate with you. I need someone to translate written documents. I need someone to do a psych eval. And it's hit or miss whether you can also get all of those services for free. I've certainly taken on pro bono immigration cases where the person has ended up paying more money to an expert witness or a translator than they would have paid to me as the lawyer if I had charged full price for the case. So, you know, often the people who are the most vulnerable and who need protection the most are the ones with the fewest resources and the ones who actually need all of this kind of complex support. So building those bigger structures where alliances between community groups and organizations involving mental health practitioners is just so important in getting these cases to a place where they have a chance of being successful.
Yeah. If I could add like the negative wrinkle to the universal representation argument, it's not really about universal representation, but I would say the downside or something that's really even more upsetting is that since the uptick in immigration enforcement prompted by the new administration, what we've also seen is a lot of attorneys who have decided that immigration is going to be something that immigration services are something they offer, and they really don't know much about immigration law. And I mean, like Julia was saying, like, you know, she has 2 master's degrees and it's still challenging. I mean, I went to law school to become an immigration lawyer, and there are still things I learn every single day. And so for somebody who does primarily, you know, DUI defense, for example, to start taking immigration cases because they hear there's a market for it, can also be really, really, really detrimental. And I'll say that we have kind of a unique view of those of us who work in nonprofits because we tend to get a lot of cases or see at our clinics where we give counsel and advice, people who gave their last $10,000 to an attorney who either didn't know what they were doing or was just outright predatory. So there's just, you know, as we talk about representation and increasing access to counsel, and I know everyone on this panel has this in mind because we've all experienced it, we also have to keep in mind we need that this is not just getting any old attorney to take an immigration case. These are really specialized cases that mistakes can have lifelong consequences for people, their families, and their communities if they're not, you know, handled with the right amount of attention.
Yeah, if your lawyer has a billboard that says like dog bites, slip and fall, disability, and immigration, maybe like don't go with that lawyer because those things just don't go together.
Yeah. I kind of want to ask a question that's been asked a little bit in the Q&A, and I was going to ask you. So I think a lot of people sometimes feel like making changes to immigration law, like federally changing the law, it feels a little bit unsurmountable, especially right now, and even maybe next year, even depending on the results of the election, it's still, you have to get Congress to do this, right? But there are things that that can be done quickly by executive action. So what are some things that you will hope that will change next year that could be easily changed, that will have big impacts, policies that will have big impacts in immigration that don't require big changes in the legislature?
So I guess there's kind of 2 separate questions, because there's executive changes that don't require any legislative action. But then there's legislative changes that are actually not that difficult or complicated. I think there's been a lot of push. We need comprehensive immigration reform. Like I said earlier, the best way to deal with the system we have now is to just burn it completely to the ground and start over. And so much of it just makes no sense. We need to completely revamp it. But I'm not super optimistic that we'll get a comprehensive top-down rebuild of our immigration system until we have a Congress that's more responsive to our needs, until we get redistricting reform and campaign finance reform. But there are some really easy things Congress could do that are probably not as controversial as a comprehensive overhaul that would make a huge difference. But one of the chief ones is just delete section 212A9 of the INA. So there's a specific section that was enacted in 1996 that creates these punishments where if you've been in the US for a certain amount of time without status, you have this punishment, which could be 3 years, 10 years, or forever. And that's why a lot of the times when you see on the news, oh, here's this really sympathetic case, this dad is getting deported and there's nothing anybody can do. The reason there's nothing anybody can do is because usually it's one of these punishments that apply. So you have a 10-year bar, you have to wait 10 years before you can even file a waiver to come back to the US. So those were all enacted in 1996 and signed by President Clinton as part of what was called the Illegal Immigration and Immigrant Reform Act. Anytime something has reform in the name, beware, because when it comes from Congress, it's usually the opposite of a reform. But so just taking away these 3 and 10-year bars, just deleting those couple sections of the INA would make so many more people eligible to come back and be with their families that I think that would be a tremendous difference, especially when you look at the social science research of how much more likely kids who grow up in single parent homes are to end up in the criminal justice system, less likely to finish high school, more likely to end up with substance abuse problems. We would be doing a tremendous service to the United States by letting these families get back together just by deleting a couple sections of the law. The other thing I think that doesn't require any legislative action was what we mentioned earlier about refugee resettlement. It's completely up to the president how many refugees the U.S. is willing to take in any given year. And I think, we're down to, I think it was like 13,000 or 18,000, which is a historic low. But a President Biden or an Attorney General Elizabeth Warren in January could say, guess what? We're going to take 250,000. And just like that, all of these refugee resettlement organizations around the country would be able to get up and running again and start integrating people back into our communities and getting them out of these camps. So those are my two. I would say raise the refugee cap and get rid of 212A9 of the INA.
I'll go. So many wishes on my wish list, so I'll try to keep it short. I think that there are a couple of really harmful new policies that I didn't mention in my first, when I was talking at the beginning, that could be reversed on day one. There's a policy that was implemented that if you apply for an immigration benefit that would give you lawful immigration status, so like a U visa or a T visa, if you apply for certain things, where if before you had applied for that benefit and it had been denied, you would have just gone out, you'd have been disappointed, but you'd have gone on to live your life. But now the Trump administration is issuing notices to appear for when a lot of these benefits are denied, and they're putting people in removal proceedings, which is encouraging the people who are here without status, who have some sort of path to, lawful status and also maybe even citizenship one day. Has a strong chilling effect to get people to apply. And that's something the Trump administration just passed a policy and started doing, and that could be reversed tomorrow or on day one of the new administration. The other thing is, Brian sort of mentioned the case in his presentation, but there has been a really harmful BIA decision that the Attorney General interfered with and sort of wrote on his own that really limits the judge's ability to sort of almost exercise their own prosecutorial discretion and administratively close cases. And ICE is very limited from being able to exercise prosecutorial discretion and close cases, even where they want to administratively close court cases where the deportation hearings are pending. And I think that is just something we've seen from the administration, and it could be reversed, tomorrow. So they need to be taking a more comprehensive look at who's in removal proceedings, who's facing imminent deportations with the final order of removal, and whether or not those removals really need to be effectuated. Because right now there's very little sort of like humane oversight as to exercise that discretion. And then I really briefly just wanted to echo Brian's 3 and 10 year bar point. A lot of people say, and just emphasize that it's true. Like a lot of people, there's this constant rhetoric of they just need to get in line. They need to come here legally, as the president likes to say. But a lot of people don't have that option for many reasons. And a big reason is because they face that bar where if they leave the United States because they've been here for a period of time without status, they can't come back unless they are outside of the United States for a period of 3 or 10 years, and some people can never come back. And I've seen that manifest in a lot of different ways, but one of the ways I see it manifest a lot is people who have been living here for 20 or 30 years, who have kids who are 21 years old, so who would be eligible to petition for their parents otherwise, because you have to be 21 to petition for your parents if you're a US citizen. But the parents are not eligible, or if the parents left the United States to go to, the consulate in Juarez or wherever to have their visa interview, they would trigger this bar and they would not be able to come back for 10 years. And that's just not doable for families. So something that really needs to be addressed in some way.
I just wanted to add, again, I'm not sure about the technicalities of this, whether Congress will be doing this or the president executive action, but whoever is the next administration should put into place universal representation. That's a must-have. It's the minimum they could do. We need culturally competent judges, culturally competent translators on every case, and they have to make sure they find the right language. If it's Fulani, find the right Fulani for someone from Mauritania. Don't bring me someone from Guinea who's a Fulani, but we don't understand each other. And you don't understand why we don't understand each other, because it's the same language. Same language, but people speak differently. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about culturally competent judges. Because I've heard judges on the phone getting frustrated because they brought 3 different translators and the person doesn't understand. I get it, it's tough, but still, we gotta find a way to serve these people. I mean, they're here. And then reform ICE. ICE needs to learn to treat people with dignity, period. There's no way around it. And end immigration detention. I know that's a long shot, but it should be. It doesn't make any sense to just put people in jails, expose them to COVID and every other disease that's out there. For what? For one, eventually you're gonna release them anyway, or deport them, but find a different way to do this without packing people in jails like sandwiches. And the 4th or 5th thing I have is stop calling people aliens. And again, this is not even Trump. This is the way immigrants are listed in legal immigration documents in this country is aliens. Immigrants are not aliens. We're people with lives, with families, with everything that a human being has. We're human beings, basically, period. So change the language. That's where the issue starts, by calling people aliens. Immigrants are not aliens, whether they're documented or not. Thanks.
So kind of along the question of, what can the, federally we can do to change and then maybe help immigrants. Is there any local policy or anything that local government can do that people can advocate with, their city councils, commissioners that will have an impact on immigrants, whether, federal law change or federal policy change, but that might be helpful. I mean, I know, and I'm not gonna kind of say Katie, but I know she does a lot of stuff when it comes to law enforcement. And, we talked about, for example, my grant that it's funded by the city of by the city council of Columbus, they give us the money to represent Columbus residents, right? So what are things that you would think, do you think that, city councils, local governments can do that people can advocate for?
There's so many things. I mean, I have a lot of ideas, but I think one thing that would be really cool, I mean, we talked a lot about detention today. I think that local city councils, it may seem really impossible for a smaller city like Dayton, for example, to fund universal representation. But one thing they could do is fund universal representation for people in bond proceedings. Because I think that probably, I don't know if this exact stat was shared and I don't have the numbers in my head, but the amount of the ability to win your case obviously drastically increases when you are not detained. You have time to find a lawyer, you have time to get the financial means to hire a lawyer, you have time to prepare your evidence. And so what we really need to do is get people out of detention. And until detention is abolished, helping those who are eligible for bond to fight that case with competent counsel is really, really crucial. And so that's something that cities can do that's not going to take the same financial needs as or means as representing all immigrants in all proceedings, which is a great goal. I want to just say, I think there's a strong push towards getting sheriffs and local police entities not to cooperate with ICE and to release some statement that they are a sanctuary city or a sanctuary, they're not going to honor ICE detainers. As somebody who represents people in a small Midwestern city, I am a little bit, I love that idea ideologically. I have concerns about the this administration's focus on targeting localities that have actively and outwardly proclaimed they will not cooperate with ICE. I worry about the risk that puts our client communities in, and our friends and neighbors in. So I'm a little bit on the fence, but I do know that that is a hot topic. So maybe Maria, Hule, or Brian have thoughts on that.
Again,
Go ahead.
I'll just go. Sorry, Ryan. I'm gonna go back to the universal representation. City council could do that. They could give like fund nonprofits or organizations like yours, Maria, to be able to assist every detained person with an immigration detention in this state or in the city to be able to have a lawyer. And once they get out, to be able to continue to have a lawyer, because the issue is not only when they're detained. When they leave the detention center, I've been working with a community member for a week. He was granted asylum, and we thought we were all celebrating, yay! He got his asylum while he was in detention. He's now out. He had when they were releasing him, they gave him no paperwork. So he calls me. He's like, "How do I get my I-94?" I'm like, "I don't know." So we had to find not a lawyer, but we had to find an organization, call ICE in some of the states, and then figure out from point A to point Z how to get him his papers. And this is someone who was already granted asylum. Imagine that. And it's been a couple of weeks, and we still trying to figure this out, filing the paperwork to be able to get his, I-94 and stuff like that. So for someone who was not, granted asylum, that person has to pursue their case outside. And if they don't have a lawyer, it's an issue. And this is something we deal with on a daily basis in the Mauritanian community. That's why I'm just gonna beat on that horse today. City council need to fund people to make sure that they have universal representation, whether they're in jail or outside.
Well, we sometimes say that the immigration court system is one where even when you win, you don't win, because even when you get asylum, there's so many other things that need to get done, and they take so much time. I won a cancellation of removal case for a guy from New Jersey who just happened to be passing through Ohio when he got detained. So we won. He's released, and he's still. I think he had to pay $120 for a taxi to take him from the jail to Toledo to get on a bus to go back to New Jersey, and he's trying to find somebody to help him get his I-94. So it's, even when you win, you don't win, because there's so many other things that need done. But to go back to the question, I think that on the local government level, one thing that could be done is more support structures for asylum seekers. So if you are a refugee who's been through the international resettlement system and come to the US, there's all kinds of federal government grant funding that provides programs for you. So like Catholic Charities in Cleveland, the International Institute of Akron, actually get federal government funding to help refugees with housing issues, with English language classes, with literacy. But for asylum seekers, for people who didn't go through a camp but came to the US and applied for asylum here, there's basically none of that support. So you could be in a situation where you're going to spend years waiting for your final asylum hearing to come up. And during that time, you don't qualify for food stamps. You don't even qualify for a work permit. You don't qualify for housing assistance. There are churches and nonprofits and community organizations that provide that support. But I think that local governments would be in their best interest to say, hey, let's take these people who, through no fault of their own, don't qualify for anything else and see if we can make them eligible for local level food and housing assistance. And then on the state level, the local governments themselves can't do this. It would have to be statewide, but driver's licenses. This is such a big issue because so many people end up in immigration detention after a traffic stop. And a lot of it is because many people aren't eligible for driver's licenses, even though they've been in the US for years, or they will be here for years as their cases work their way through the system. So there's nothing stopping, other than the political will is not there. There's nothing stopping the state of Ohio from saying, you can qualify for an Ohio driver's license irrespective of your federal immigration status. Many states have actually done that. They've said, look, whatever your federal immigration status, that's between you and Uncle Sam. That's the federal government, not us. You can deal with ICE, deal with the courts, fine. But for our purposes as the state of California or the state of Michigan, you're eligible for a driver's license as long as you have whatever, your home country form of ID or whatever it is. So if we, were able to muster the political will in the Ohio General Assembly and got just driver's licenses for people who had pending court cases, say, or people who, have lived here for a certain number of years, regardless of their federal immigration status, that would do a lot towards reducing the number of people who then get sent to ICE detention because of traffic stops. And I think it would also just make our roads generally much safer, which how can someone be opposed to that, right? Here's easy legislation that would make everybody safer. Why not do it? Beats me. Politics.
We don't have a ton of time left, but I do want to just touch on one topic when it comes to detention and COVID, because I don't know that a lot of people know what's been going on at some of the jails. So Ohio right now, we have 4 of the county jails that have the ICE detainees. So Butler, Seneca, Geauga, and Morrow. Youngstown used to have them, but they stopped taking ICE detainees in February. So, there's been outbreaks, particularly at Morrow. Pretty much everybody had it at some point. So I wanted to see either Katie or Brian want to talk about some of the things that have been happening in detention. I mean, I used to go to Butler County Jail every week to do presentations. And so I was able to do, know your rights presentation and give people ideas of what's going on, kind of, find clients and all that. And I haven't been able to go back since March due to COVID. So I wanted to know, Brian's experience, what Katie knows about the situation.
Go ahead, Brian.
So I just did my first jail visit since March last week because COVID hit, things started to get locked down. We all know as lawyers how unclean a lot of these jails are in general, let alone with a once in a lifetime global pandemic. And access to counsel is so much more difficult in a detention center when you put the pandemic on top of all of that. It just creates nightmarish conditions. I have a gentleman who's been detained for 3 years. He has never committed a crime in his life. He's got 2 little kids who are permanent residents. His wife is a permanent resident. We've submitted all these affidavits to ICE to just let him out. He's not a flight risk. He's not a danger. We filed 4 different cases at the 6th Circuit for this guy. One of them is still pending. And we finally got his case remanded back to the immigration judge. He's going to have a new trial in a week or so. So I went back to see him, and all of the visits are non-contact now, meaning that even as an attorney, where you would typically have a room with a table and you could sit there with your client, you're now talking to them through those glass barriers with those little black phones on the wall. There's audio quality issues. You have to bring your own Clorox wipes to sanitize the phones. It's hard to hear with your mask on. You're kind of shouting at your client the whole time. And I mean, let's be real. When you're going over things like, tell me again in detail how badly you were tortured. This is not the kind of thing you want to be shouting through this little black phone, through a mask, through a glass window. So the access thing has just gotten much more difficult. And the nonprofits that were doing these Know Your Rights presentations don't have that. Like Maria was saying, don't have that access anymore. So in the past, people who with a little bit of advice could maybe help take advantage of their own rights, they're just not getting those services anymore because we as lawyers don't have the same level of access. So, and then to make matters worse, you file all of this evidence with, let's say you submit a bond motion to the judge and say, Judge, look, here's where he's going to live. Here's his lack of criminal record. Here's all his family ties. And here's how dangerous COVID is. And you file some newspaper articles. They just don't seem to be giving a lot of weight to that, to the pandemic, when in fact, several people around the country have died either in ICE detention or shortly after being released from ICE detention of COVID. One of the issues is that you usually can't succeed on a wrongful death lawsuit against the government. So if someone dies in an ICE jail, there's usually no consequences for Uncle Sam. So that's why a lot of times they're just willing to kind of let these situations fester. So yeah, access has not been great, and there's no sort of end in sight as far as I can see for when we'll be able to go back into the jails and meet with large groups of people again. Who knows if that will ever be the case?
Yeah, Maria, some others at ABLE and I represented people who were detained at Morrow County Jail, and now one gentleman detained at Butler County Jail in a habeas case to try to have the court order their release. So I know more about Morrow County Jail and COVID outbreaks there. And it, you know, as Brian mentioned, conditions in jails generally are not clean and not sanitary. And so when you take a pandemic like what we're seeing now with COVID, they had, for example, Morrow County Jail had a near 100% infection rate. And some of the physicians we talked to in preparing for our habeas case were just absolutely outraged by what type of terrible conditions, unsanitary conditions would cause a near 100% infection rate in entire jail. So almost everyone, if not everyone, had COVID at one point in time in the jail, you know, around April, May, June. They're not being offered PPE. They're not being offered their proper PPE. They're not being offered, you know, their sheets aren't being cleaned, the bathrooms aren't being sanitized, there's improper, not enough access to soap and hand sanitizer and water and things like that, or and hot water to wash your hands and things like that. The jails are still, when we were litigating, they had decreased the population, but, you know, they're starting to increase the population again. And so when that jail is full, people are sleeping in beds that are like 16 inches apart. So there's no social distancing. And so it's really spreading like wildfire in there, on top of the fact that you have a lot of, and I'll only speak for Morrow because I don't necessarily know or could suspect in other areas. In other jails, you have, you know, really poor access to medical care generally. You have people admitting that they're using other detainees to interpret for people who are having trouble breathing, who are having anxiety attacks. And they're basically having no effective way to communicate with people to figure out about their symptoms and what has clearly has life-threatening potential consequences. And it gets into other systemic issues, like when ICE does its initial, or I guess the jail, on behalf of ICE does its initial intake, are they actually really doing health screenings? Like there are some people who has a very clear comorbidities for COVID, like asthma, high blood pressure, that we were able to access medical records confirming they had these comorbidities, but on their intakes, they weren't there. And there were people who had allergic reactions and allergies to things, and you saw on their intakes that ICE was just like, we see this, but we're not going to record it when they're jail transferred. That was literally written down. And then this person, one of my clients had an allergic reaction, had to be taken to the hospital. So like the lack of all these things that were always there are being completely, really being exacerbated by COVID. And sadly, you know, while some people were able to get out of detention for a while, and some who were in jail for criminal reasons, you know, that's not been a lasting form of relief. And it just shows the ineptitude of a lot of local jails to actually house detainees, particularly given the hugely increased numbers under the Trump administration of how many detainees we're seeing. They're just not equipped to do it and have no business doing it. And COVID's really shown that.
Yeah, it's been really bad, particularly at Morrow, because I was working with Katie on that case, and I wish we could talk more. We have so many questions in the Q&A that we didn't even get to, but we only have 1 minute. So I want to thank you guys so much for agreeing to come today and speaking. You were amazing. I hope everybody learned a lot today. We tried to keep it simple for the people that don't have a lot of background in immigration. And I know we didn't get to all your questions. The session is recorded, and we will be sharing it because people were asking about that. We will be sharing it either next week or the week following. We're recording all 4 sessions. On our website, we also have a section for resources. So we have listed our organization's websites, places where you can whether donate or organizations, campaigns, different things that you can get involved. There's a lot of things that you can do, even if you are not a lawyer or I know I'm about to go over time, but I want to give an example. For example, in Dayton, there's an organization that helps people with rights to court, because a lot of people have gotten picked up and detained driving into Cleveland, although from Cincinnati or Dayton to Cleveland by highway patrol. So it's really dangerous for people who have no driver's license to drive to Cleveland. So there's a group here that helps people to go to USCIS interviews. So there's a lot of things that you locally can do that doesn't necessarily involve becoming a lawyer. But if you're a lawyer, try to maybe think about getting into immigration law. We do need more immigration attorneys in Ohio. So I want to thank everybody for coming. Like I said, we're going to send an evaluation around, as well as the recording. And on our website, you can, like I said, go to the resources. There's a lot of information there that we've gathered from all the speakers in all the different panels. So thank you, everybody. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.